Okay, so welcome everyone. I see about 50 participants plus. Welcome everyone to our webinar on the upcoming Glasgow Climate Summit, COP26. It's organized by the Center for Environment, Sustainability and Human Development at the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. And this webinar has been arranged jointly between the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities and the School of Government and Public Policy at Jindal Global University. So we have excellent range of speakers today. I'll introduce the speakers to you one by one. But let's welcome all the all the audience. We have at least the registration numbers I saw. We had not only the majority of them are our students from the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities, but we also have a strong contingent from the School of Public Government and Public Policy. Plus, we have a lot of students from outside our university as well. Special welcome to them. I saw several people from Terry University. We had Azim Premji University. We had several Kriya University, several other universities. And we have a few other NGOs, people from different NGOs, a few journalists. So it's quite a mix of people who are attending this event. And we are, like most of our events, we try to tailor our events to a wider general audience. So it's not just, very expert postgraduate students who are the audience of this event. So a wide range of people with different backgrounds can relate to the events that we organize, and they can at least take away something. You do not need to be an environmental studies major, or you do not need to be an expert in energy or climate policy to really benefit from our events. So what is the topic? What is the theme of our event today? As we know, I'll offer a little bit of background before we introduce our speakers. We know that a very big event, important event is starting next week in Glasgow, the so-called Climate Conference of Parties, the Climate COP. It's the 26th COP for the UN Climate Treaty, and this is supposed to be a very big, important event because the Paris Climate Agreement, with the UN Climate Treaty has a long history going back to 1992, and it has tried to improve things step by step. Initially, it was very weak. Then we had the Kyoto Protocol. Then that achieved a little bit, not much. Then we had in 2015 we had the Paris Agreement, and in the Paris Agreement, the main approach was to give countries independence to come up with their own targets and timelines. So that was a key approach. That what it was understood that imposed targets were not working. We had many years of stalemate, and imposed targets were not working. So the idea was to give countries flexibility to determine their own targets and timelines. And but the goal was to keep climate change within 2 degrees Celsius and preferably within 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is the limit that scientists believe is beyond. If we cross that, it would cause what is called catastrophic climate change. Climate change is already happening, as we know. We see on the news lots of natural disasters happening. But if we cross that threshold into catastrophic climate change, that would lead to large-scale economic disaster. It's not just isolated disasters. The cumulative impact of all these disasters would lead to large-scale economic collapse, which would trigger social and political collapse as well. So that is why this point is not really understood by the wider public. Most people, when we think of climate change, we think of isolated natural disasters. But the cumulative impact of disasters, if we have runaway climate change, the cumulative impact of the disasters is going to cause widespread economic collapse, and which will trigger social and political collapse as well. That is why we absolutely must avoid catastrophic climate change. That is why scientists put the 2-degree limit, and even better if we try to achieve 1.5 degrees. We already have more than 1.1 degrees Celsius, so time is very short. We only have maybe a couple of decades to avoid catastrophic climate change. There's only a set amount of CO2 that we can emit into the atmosphere before we reach the 2-degree limit. And we know how much we are emitting every year. So if you just divide that, the atmospheric limit, by how much we are emitting every year, you get barely 20 years before you hit 2 degrees. But if we, and we're not even declining, the overall global emissions are not declining, they keep increasing every year. So that means if we keep increasing every year, we have less than 20 years. Conversely, if we are able to decrease our emissions every year, then we are buying ourselves more time, because our transition will take a long time. So the important thing is to really start reducing emissions now, globally. I mean, if 1 or 2 countries reduce their emissions, it's a good thing, but it doesn't help. Globally, we must reduce our emissions so that we buy ourselves more time. We can stretch that 20 years to further longer. Now, the problem with the Paris Climate Agreement, as we noted, is because countries set their own targets. They were very weak. They were not ambitious enough. If you add up all the pledges that were made in Paris, we do not reach 2 degrees. We are actually crossing 3 degrees. So it is widely understood that countries must increase their pledges. So under the Paris Agreement, there's a condition that every 5 years, countries have to renew their commitments. They have to submit revised pledges. And this, the COP that is coming up, every year we have an annual meeting, which is called a COP, the Conference of Parties. And this one in Glasgow, this is the one which is 5 years after Paris. In fact, it was supposed to happen last year, but last year it got cancelled due to the COVID pandemic. So it got pushed back 1 year to this November. So this COP is so important because this is the time where countries are supposed to submit revised pledges, more ambitious pledges. And these pledges must keep us on track to meet our ultimate 2-degree goal. To meet the 2-degree goal, we must become, globally, we must become net carbon neutral by 2050. Now, if you think like that, 2050 seems like a long way off. But in fact, unless we meet intermediate short-term targets, we can never hope to meet the 2050 goal. If we are asleep till 2040 or 2045, you cannot just wake up in 2045 and say we are going to meet the goal in 5 years. You need to keep on track. Energy transition takes time, mitigation takes time, reduction takes time. So you have to meet intermediate targets. You have to meet 2030 targets. So the big thing that everyone is looking forward to, that in this COP, upcoming COP, is that countries will not only pledge for 2050 targets, but also importantly, intermediate targets. What are you going to concretely achieve by 2030? So that is why this is so important, because we cannot wait. If we wait another 5 years, if it's already 2025, when the next time it comes to revise our targets, it will already be too late to meet whatever 2030 targets you are planning. So now we have at least 10 years. So that is why it is difficult to underestimate how important this event is. So many people have called it a make or break moment in terms of global climate negotiations. So that is the context of this event. And now the last point I want to make is why have we identified these 4 big players? We have speakers covering the US, EU, China, and India. Now these countries make up the majority of the world's emissions. China is number 1, of course. More like a third of global emissions come from China. The US is number 2, and EU is number 3 collectively. But if you look at a single country, then India is number 3. EU collectively becomes number 3, India is number 4. But if you look at a single country, then it is China, US, and India. So these are obviously the 4 big ones. Of course, you can see that 2 of them are still developing countries, China and India. So why are we including the developing countries in the mix? Because in terms of absolute amount of emissions, yes, they are developing countries, but in terms of absolute amount of emissions, they are huge. So unless in the past, if you go back to the Kyoto Protocol, the argument was that developing countries should not have targets right now, because developed countries started emitting a long time back. So they should take lead in reducing emissions. Developing countries should not have reduction targets right now. But since we are facing such an urgency, and it is no longer feasible to continue with the same argument. The biggest developing countries, their emissions, the absolute emissions are so huge that they must also join the table. Of course, this idea is called common but differentiated responsibilities. Their approach could be somewhat different compared to the US, compared to EU. China and India's approach could be somewhat different, and they may very well claim that they need to receive finance from the developed countries. But nonetheless, they must be on the table simply because their overall emissions are so huge. So these four countries effectively will make or break the success or failure, determine the success or failure of this event. So that is the rationale for this event. So with that, let me introduce our speakers today. Let me pull up their bios, just a minute. Okay. So we have four speakers, beginning with Professor Marcos Luna, who shall be talking about the role of the US. Professor Luna is a professor of geography and sustainability and coordinator of the graduate geoinformation science program at Salem State University in Boston. His research focuses on environmental justice and applications of geospatial techniques to social and environmental inequities, particularly around climate change. He works with climate community organizations and policymakers on hazard mitigation, equitable planning, and climate change adaptation. He is the chair of the board of directors of Green Roots, NGO focusing on environmental justice in Massachusetts. He has received his PhD in urban affairs and public policy from the University of Delaware. So welcome to Marcos. And Marcos also happens to be my former colleague when I was at the University of Delaware. Our next speaker representing the European Union is Professor Annika Bose-Dzinski, Associate Professor and Associate Dean of German nationality at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. In her research, she's focused on the governance of socio-technical transitions and market structures for cleaner and more efficient energy technologies in both advanced industrial as well as developing countries. She teaches courses in sustainable food, water, and energy governance, comparative public policy, and political philosophy. She is also the founding director of the Jindal Center for Holistic Advisory on Resources and Energy Governance, in short, JCHARG. Welcome to Annika. Our next speaker covering China is Dr. Avinash Godbole, who is Associate Professor of International Relations and China Studies at the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. He completed his PhD in Chinese Studies from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU. His doctoral thesis focused on the political economy of China's environment. He was a visiting Fox Fellow at the Macmillan Center at Yale in 2007-2008. His research interests include China's foreign policy and Asia strategy, Chinese party studies, China's minority policies, energy and environmental policies. He has written extensively on these issues in academic and media publications. Previously, he has worked for the International Council of World Affairs and the IDSA, the Defense Studies Association. He is also a visiting faculty at the Naval War College, Goa, since June 2020. Welcome to Avinash. Final speaker, Dr. Gopal Sarangi, who is going to represent the Indian focus from the Terry School of Advanced Studies. He is an economist by training, but has deep inclination towards interdisciplinary research with special focus on energy market and regulation, intersection of energy technologies, fuels, and resources with public policy, governance, and institutional analysis of energy transition. He is a faculty member at the Terry School of Advanced Studies in New Delhi, teaching in areas of energy economics and policy, environmental economics, and development economics. He has widely published in top-rated journals such as Energy Policy, Renewable and Sustainable Energy Reviews, Climate and Energy, etc., and worked extensively in sponsored projects funded by the Government of India, World Bank, DFID, IRENA, and so on. He's currently working on projects focusing on decarbonization of India's transport sector and devising ways of innovative climate and energy financing. Okay. So we have introduced all our excellent speakers today. Before we start, I would just want to mention that all our speakers will be focusing mainly not necessarily on detailed analysis of the energy policy of the respective countries or regions. Our emphasis is on the political economy. The world is looking at these four actors. Now, are they going to live up to the expectations? at the negotiations next week, the indications are not very hopeful. Many of these countries have enormous political and economic constraints. So what are the factors that are influencing these countries to adopt the positions that they have already adopted? What can we expect from them? And what is driving their position in the negotiations? What is driving their positions when they adopt policies or do not adopt policies? So the emphasis will be mainly on the political economy of how these countries are approaching this problem. So with that introduction, I now turn over to our first speaker. Welcome to Professor Marcus.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending. Let us begin by acknowledging that in terms of cumulative emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the U.S. is the single largest contributor since the start of the Industrial Revolution.
Marcos, is it possible to increase your volume a little bit?
Let me see.
I can hear you, but it would be nicer if it was a little louder. Or maybe you can speak up.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Okay, I apologize. So the U.S. is the largest contributor, as I was saying, to the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And it has been, that contribution has been continuing to grow until very recently. On an annual basis, total emissions have declined 13% since their peak in 2005. And on a per capita basis, emissions have declined by 23% since 2000. Most of this improvement has been driven by economic forces rather than by focused climate policy. In particular, reductions in greenhouse gases are attributable to a switch to less carbon-intensive fuels for electricity production, particularly from coal to natural gas, as a result of greater availability and lower prices for natural gas, and to some extent, the avoided costs of pollution control. As a whole, the US economy has become much less energy or carbon intensive. Since 1990, greenhouse gas emissions per dollar of goods and services produced by the US economy declined by 50%. And this change is due to increased energy efficiency and structural changes in the economy, so that heavy industry has largely moved out of the country. US climate policy, if we can call it that, has been uneven and contradictory, particularly with regard to international agreements. Until the early 1990s, the issue of climate change had not yet become a partisan issue in the US. In 1992, a Republican US president, the Conservative Party, George H.W. Bush, signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was then ratified by the US Senate, or the upper legislative body, on a bipartisan basis. 5 years later, in 1997, however, President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, the Liberal Party, signed the Kyoto Protocol, but could not get the US Senate, which was led by Republicans, to ratify it. By this time, the political polarization around climate change was very apparent. In 2001, President George W. Bush, a Republican, declared the US would not sign the Kyoto Protocol because he and his fellow Republicans argued it exempted developing nations such as China and India from mandatory emissions limits, putting the US at an economic disadvantage. In 2015, President Barack Obama pledged to cut US emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025 under the Paris Climate Agreement. 2 years later, in 2017, President Trump, a Republican, declared that the US would withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And then 3 years later, in 2020, President Biden, a Democrat, declared the US would rejoin the Paris Agreement. Since the mid-1990s, climate policy in the US has suffered in part from a well-organized and well-funded disinformation campaign led by oil and gas industry and their political allies, but also from a deep political polarization within the country that goes beyond climate change politics. To some extent, these two currents of misinformation and political polarization aligned, and a sort of culture of denialism around climate change has been created within the US. Many conservative political leaders in a large swath of the American public, it seemed, proclaimed that climate change was either an exaggerated threat, a conspiracy theory against American economic interests, or even just liberal politics masquerading as science. Sociological research has found that climate change denialism in the US is less about scientific ignorance or even willful stupidity, and more about identity. For many Americans, the facts of any particular dispute are irrelevant to their political identity. Climate change has been very deliberately associated with the liberal or left-wing politics, and thus was by default highly suspect for Americans who identify as Republicans or conservatives more generally. This politics of identity is not just about climate change, but has become very apparent even with the COVID pandemic response across the country. Regular polling by Yale University in the US has shown that only a minority of Americans, actually about 20%, are doubtful or dismissive of climate change. The vast majority of Americans, in fact, accept that climate change is real and that it is a threat. However, this broad sentiment does not necessarily translate into policy. Political leadership in the US is extremely polarized, and action on climate change continues to fall along political party lines. President Biden plans to pledge to cut US greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2030. However, it's not clear how this can be accomplished, particularly because the domestic policy proposals in which he was planning look as if they will not be approved by the US Congress. Moreover, any new treaty agreements will need to be ratified by the US Senate, over which the Democrats have only the weakest control. Congressional elections in the US take place next week, and by all accounts, the Democrats are likely to lose control of the upper house or the Senate. Part of the difficulty for the US in addressing big problems like climate change is that our structure of politics and decision-making is intentionally complex and diffused. We have a federalist system in which the 50 states that make up the US are sovereign in many issues, particularly on economic issues. We don't have a strong centralized national authority. The president has limited powers with regard to implementing existing laws that Congress has authorized, and Congress controls the budget and the laws. Congress holds a lot of power, but is itself a complex institution. In particular, the Congress is structured in such a way that all states, regardless of their population or geographic size, have nearly equal power in the US Senate. Although most Americans live in dense urban areas along the coastlines, where politics are generally more liberal, it's the rural and more conservative regions of the country that hold power in Congress, and that power is disproportionate to their size or population representation. This structure was intentionally designed to provide disproportionate power to smaller states. As a result, minority conservative views hold powerful sway in American politics. So these are some of the challenges of American climate policy. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, Marcos, thank you very much for such a short introduction. In only 7 minutes, you were able to capture nicely all the complex and multifaceted problems associated with US climate policy. And, to sum up, the US politics is dominated, you could say unfairly, by these conservative forces which predominantly downplay the importance of climate change. Not only is there disinformation campaign that this is supposedly a conspiracy theory, but also there's this polarization where conservatives are going to oppose anything that the liberals are saying, So even if it's scientifically valid, they're going to oppose it just because liberals are saying. So unfortunately, this dynamic is we cannot escape this dynamic, and we also heard that even though the majority of people feel that we should take strong action, the minority, the political structure of the US is such that the minority can block effective action. So even in the coming years, we may have a president who is quite progressive. We had President Obama, we had President Biden, but unless the composition of Congress changes, it's very unlikely that we can expect a very revolutionary climate policy from the US, which is very unfortunate because the US is the leading diplomatic country in the world. Without the US participation, things are may not move. So we see this kind of almost like what appears to be an insurmountable problem. The domestic politics of the US is preventing strong action at the international level. So we can, I'm sure you all have more questions. We'll come back to Marcos later. Let us move on to our next speaker, Professor Nika. What is the role of the EU? The EU has been quite progressive so far, but how far can they go alone on their own? If other people don't step up, how far can the EU go alone? Over to you, Nika.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to present today here in this auspicious circle. I would like to step back a little bit. I think we identify with climate change in a somewhat different way because industrialization started over here, and also from a scientific perspective, the understanding of the greenhouse gas effect is from within Europe. We have Fourier, we have Arrhenius, who is a relative, an early relative of Greta Thunberg. We have John Tyndall, we have Schellenhuber and Peake, people doing the research and really having, in collaboration with American scientists and others around the globe, helped us to better understand what climate change is, and also helped us consolidate the information around, you know, the solidity of the issue. And this is actually something that we have to take serious. And you find that confirmed in the Nobel Peace Prize of 2007 for the IPCC, and for Al Gore for their efforts to build up and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate change, and to lay the foundations for the measures that are needed to counteract such a change. And then just recently, 2021, the Nobel Peace Prize for Professor Manabe, Klaus Hasselmann, and Giorgio Parisi, to demonstrate that our knowledge about climate rests on a solid scientific foundation. I just went into the 1995 paper of Hasselmann, who already then emphasized on maximizing global well-being while reducing GHG emissions. And I think this is absolutely critical, that we combine well-being, maybe in the form of GDP growth, with the deep decarbonization of our economies. Let me open my presentation to show you what we've done within the EU. Is that visible to you? Yeah. So you've already pointed out that, you know, the negotiations around climate change go back to the 1990s. Our understanding is much older. We have different stages. It started in 2007 and 2008 when the first package came out, that looked primarily at 3 different areas: emissions reductions, renewable energy increase, and energy efficiency improvements, all in the range of 20%, reduction 20%, increase of renewables, and improvements in energy efficiency of 20%. Today, we don't really have complete 2020 data, but just in terms of emissions, we have reduced by 24%, which, yes, we're absolutely within our targets, but definitely not within what's required to really stay below 2 degrees or even 1.5. If you want me to open this box up a little bit, we have especially the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and Slovakia, which have reduced significantly in the range of 45 to 65% even on the 1990 basis, which are not necessarily known for their strong economic performance, but in part also the the deindustrialization of Eastern countries, also Eastern Germany, made significant contributions to GHG emissions reductions. And then we have the top 5 emitters within Europe: Germany, France, Italy, Poland, which also contributed roughly 20 to even 30%, 40% GHG emission reductions. Different from Spain, another top emitter, which increased emission by 9%, but that's under the negotiated burden sharing agreement. So not every state is necessarily forced to reduce. There are negotiations among the different states. The UK has left us, but is another major contributor, has also reduced emissions significantly. I think an interesting case to study when it comes to the coal phase out. And there's also a lot of excellent research done, for example, at the University of Sussex and other places. I was asked earlier about Brexit and the implications of Brexit with regard to EU climate policy. And, my first impulse would be that there's not really a correlation between the two, though on a second thought, Brexit has certainly delayed things for sure. If someone wants to divorce you, you might obviously, that might obviously impact your capacity to pay full attention to other issues. In that particular case, how you want to decarbonize your economy. So there's certainly also more precise research on that out there, but let me leave it to that. In the end, the head of the UN Climate Secretariat just came out with the message that given the current NDCs submitted and even the revisions, we are headed for a 60% increase globally. Within Europe, we're trying to reduce further, and I think we will, simply also because renewables are becoming more affordable and batteries are becoming more affordable. So the cost benefit analysis or the cost comparative analysis is tilted towards renewables, clearly. Also because of carbon pricing. I want to delve a little later, a little deeper into a very local issue over here that reflects it in essence, what's going on. But still, you see that in 2014 we sharpened our targets. Then after 2015, after the Paris Agreement, we understood that we actually need to go further. As soon as Ursula von der Leyen became the new commissioner, she actually immediately started to work on what we now call climate neutral Europe, the first continent on this globe that is actually trying to achieve complete climate neutrality. I want to say about Ursula von der Leyen that she's a mother of 7. And I think her kids are pressing in her back in some functional way. They are of the age of the kids and activists around Fridays for Future. And I think she very well understands the urgency. Let me tell you a little more about the German case and the Friday for Future movement. We had a filing of a case against the German climate law on the basis of the protection of the natural foundation of life and animals, Article 20A of the Basic Law. And actually, these kids were arguing that their rights, the rights of the next generation, are not maintained, not protected. And they were actually successful, which led to the German cabinet to revise the German legislation and making even more ambitious pledges. So what's interesting about this,
2 minutes, I think 2 minutes.
Okay, what's interesting about this climate and neutral Europe idea is that it's actually opening up. It is becoming much more comprehensive. And now let me give you this one case around clean energy and sustainable farming. Here in my very county, we're gonna get, or municipality even, we're planning to have a solar park. The issue with the solar park is that it bitterly divides the community. The ones who understand climate change were very much pro renewable energies and this entire transition towards cleaner fuels, even within mobility, battery electric vehicles, so on and so forth. And then you have the organic farmer who's also more on the sustainable side, but he sees the minimum wage going up and he sees the land lease prices going up. So he is against the solar park, though his rooftop is full of solar, simply because it will ruin his business. And that's in essence already a critical issue that's completely dividing the community. You see all these other areas. Also, a major issue, the buildings which run on oil and gas. Sustainable mobility. Actually, all sectors have reduced emissions except for road transport within the EU. And what we actually need is a kind of Marshall Plan. So when we look at sustainable finance, we're looking at roughly €1 trillion needed to make that climate neutral Europe happening. As part of that, we have something called No One is Left Behind, a just transition mechanism, which kind of ties in to this entire idea of we actually have to work on getting people here on the ground integrated into this entire and huge transition. Let me just say 2 more words, one on Poland. Poland relies 80% on coal for its electricity and is trying to kind of get the EU to commit to more funding to move away from fossil fuels. And it has now backed out of that agreement on climate neutral Europe. They just say Poland will be reaching climate neutrality at its own pace. And it's actually becoming a really big issue as part of the entire relation between a somewhat sovereign nation state under the umbrella of EU regulations. But even if we have these dissenters within the EU, that will not keep us from pushing for deeper cuts, for sure. As Sunita Narayan, and you have also mentioned that earlier, pointed out, climate change is a make or break case. And I'm currently reading Jaspreet Bindra's The Tech Whisperer. And there's he says something very true about the digital transformation, which I think fully applies to this transformation, the decarbonization as well. He says every successful digital, you can say decarbonization, transformation, exercise or initiative was successful for many reasons. However, the ones that failed did so for only one reason. And that one reason is people. So in other words, we need to make sure that this is going to be a just transition as deeply and widely as possible. And I want to close with that, and I'm open to your questions.
Thank you, Anika. You may stop sharing your screen. So we heard about some important issues in the EU. We saw the reductions they've already achieved, the progressive policies that they have already adopted. And we also noted that everyone is not on the same page in the EU. Poland is highly dependent on coal, so they are resisting. The EU as a whole may want to move even more ambitious targets, but countries that are highly dependent on coal are not so enthusiastic. So we see different countries are pulling in different directions. Despite that, the EU tries to move forward with ambitious policies. We'll come back with questions to Anika. Moving on to our next speaker on China, Professor Avinash. China is a developing country, but it is the largest emitter. But nonetheless, I mean, if you look at some of the statistics in China, they are like astronomical. But China, I'm sure you've seen some statistics like China used more concrete in 10 years than the US used in 100 years. So you see all kinds of statistics that sound impossible. It just goes to give you an idea of how fast China is growing. So it's no surprise that China has recently become the #1 emitter, even though they are a developing country, just because of the scale of their industry. Despite that, China is the world leader in renewable energy. How much they have achieved both domestically in terms of investments and growth of renewable energy sector, electric cars. We will hear some details from Avinash, and also helping to lower the price of solar worldwide. Just because of mass manufacturing, the price of solar has dropped because of mass manufacturing in China. So China has already, this is not really well understood that China has done a lot. But the fact that we are in such a short timeline forces us to ask more of China. So can China commit to more reductions, even though it's a developing country?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Abhijit, for inviting me to speak on this panel. Now, my presentation is slightly different. I'm going to be speaking more on the political side of it rather than the environmental side, and maybe it's a little less data than what the two speakers have presented here. Now, in the days leading to the conference, China has released three separate documents. 3 days ago, maybe four days ago, they released a document called Working Guidance on Carbon Dioxide Peaking and Neutrality, which spoke of peaking of carbon emissions by 2030 and neutrality by 2060, being consistent with the previously mentioned targets. They have also mentioned that there will be further decline in the energy intensity of the productions made in China by 65% compared to 2005 levels. And one of the most important noticed data is that by 2050, I think, by 2060, at least 80% of the entire energy will come from non-fossil fuels. But that transition, but for that China is taking to that 2060 number. So that short answer, if China is going to make that major change, is no. So the pressure is on China to turn that, achieve those targets by 2050. But as you will see in what I speak next, it's almost impossible for them to achieve, because while what they have achieved by now is quite spectacular, continuing on the same trajectory might be difficult because of several reasons. So the second document that came out just a day and then, like 2 days ago, was a white paper that the State Council issued. So it speaks on the usual points of it reiterates the position that China is a large developing country, at least on 16 occasions. It praises itself and its own work for good reason, that despite being a large developing country, China has done well on issues like energy basket diversification, the expansion of renewables. It also argues that China is going to keep ahead on the carbon intensity target. It's well ahead on the forestry, reforestry, and forest density target. I think they have done exceedingly well on that, by 1.25 to 1.5% consistently over the last 4 years. The two targets that are going to be difficult for them to achieve is the emissions peaking and the non-fossil fuel targets. The third document that came from China and on the UNFCCC website was the NDC. Again, it was seen as a status quo NDC and not much change from what they have stated before. So, and the reason why Xi Jinping is not attending, by now it's almost clear that Xi Jinping is not going to attend. So if you read these documents and look at the fact that the targets are consistent with what he announced last year at the UNGA, and again this year it's consistent with that. So they are not going to move much beyond what they have announced. Now, why did Paris succeed? Paris conference succeeded because of the US-China cooperation. There's no second thought on this. And in between Copenhagen and Paris, there was a massive US-China cooperation which brought up China as a responsible stakeholder. Now, China operates on three principles of achieving profit, retaining the power for the party, and then status, that is prestige for China in the international forum. So in summits before Paris, China is seen as a villain, but in Paris, China is seen as a maker of the deal rather than a disruptor. But behind that was the US-China 10-year cooperation framework and the legacy of Obama administration. In fact, the spectacular growth in China's electric mobility in scooters and cars, and the BYD kind of corporation, say for example, the BYD corporation in Shenzhen, with technology coming from US and Germany and investments from Korea and Japan and so on. So that is an example of how the US investments and lifting of sanctions on technology transfers, which were seen as core technologies previously. That case study can be seen as an example. So at its peak 2 years ago, 23% of the cars sold in China were electric vehicles. The number has dropped a little bit in the last year and a half. I'm not too sure about the data for the first half of this year, but I think some of the websites mention that Europeans are buying more electric cars compared to China in this year. But again, COVID might be responsible for that, and besides some other reasons. Now, looking at China's own environmental problems, there's a cyclical pattern of 6 years actually. So there are 4 good years and 2 bad years. I have seen this from 1990, and we are in that 2 bad year of phase. So the floods that you see this year in 2 provinces, almost 2 million people having to relocate, 500 dead. And I just saw the number this morning on how much of that cost was. It's staggering actually. See, almost $28 billion by formal accounting. So China is at the peak of that 4-year, 2-year cycle. This may be the peak. So this pattern continues in China, 3 or 4 good years of environment and pollution management, and then 2 years suddenly down. So we saw this in 14-15 when there was that smog problem. Then after a good year of Beijing Olympics, again 2009-10 was a bad year. So we are at that cyclical pattern. So hopefully the next couple of years might see a better outcome. The 4th document that underpins China's potential position is the 14th Five-Year Plan. And in that also they have made several commitments. And the 5th important document was the 19th Party Congress, when China actually changed the social contract that the party has with its people, and it has agreed to focus on quality of life issues. So rather than focusing just on the livelihood issues, it's going to focus on quality of life issues. So the Chinese policymakers are aware that people have seen these issues of air pollution and water pollution, cancer hotspot villages because of degraded soil, over fertilization being a cause, and dyes and paper industries upstream being a cause, etc. Also, milk pollution, the milk powder scandal kind of, I mean, it's seen as a governance problem, but also a pollution problem. So people are aware and they are demanding actions. So what the government has done is respond to that situation. So that is going to be underpinning what China does at Glasgow. So China needs actually global investment, global technology, and capacity building because climate change is a domestic problem for China rather than a global problem. And most of the documents, all of the Chinese documents underpin the statement that every action is determined on the basis of domestic priorities. So where environmental requirements are domestically driven, they will continue to do this action. The white paper that I mentioned previously also speaks of this issue of the financing, technology, and capacity building. And China believes, I believe India also believes that we are firmly in the era of deglobalization. So is this going to come anyway at all? Finance commitments from US, I think, was $100 billion a year, and none of that, or hardly anything of that, has come. Technology transfer is not good enough as yet. And for capacity building, you cannot have actually capacity building in the developing world if you're going to operate on the basis of visa restrictions and restricted entries and more sanctions. Now, like I mentioned, the US-China relations guaranteed the Paris Accords success. Before I close, I'll go back to that. So from Copenhagen to Paris, China was told that it is a responsible stakeholder. China began to believe that it is a responsible stakeholder in the international situation, climate situation, and that underpinned its position. The second was domestic air and water pollution challenges, and the third was US-China framework, like I mentioned. So it was an opportunity to get more technology, opportunity to win more friends in the world, engage more closely with the West. But again, after Trump and in the era of deglobalization, things are different. For example, in that previous era, China was able to leapfrog the hybrid vehicles technology entirely, I think almost entirely. They did not have scaled up production of hybrid vehicles, something that India is also trying to do right now. When Biden administration came to power, it was seen that it would take a slightly more cooperative approach. But again, that is not true. Its friendship with China is issue specific. So the Huawei officers, Meng Wanzhou's release was seen as a thaw, but telecom sector disputes continue. China continues to violate the Taiwanese airspace, and US cannot give it more concession if it does that. The issue of what's happening in Hong Kong will underpin US-China relations, and the developments in Xinjiang and the sanctioning of products and companies doing business in Xinjiang is also a reason. Strengthening of NATO statements and G20 statements on China, and the qualitative upgradation of Quad initiative from secretaries to ministers to heads of government who have met twice this year, first virtually and then in person on the sidelines of the UNGA this year. So China is not going to treat climate change in isolation. It's going to treat it as part of the whole package. Yeah, I'll finish in 2 minutes. And so it may not treat this climate change as an isolated strategy. China would also look at what constraints that US has domestically. That was highlighted by the previous speaker. So upcoming elections, ability to implement energy transition in the US, and the reciprocity of these commitments. So what will drive China's policy at Glasgow? First is domestic assessment and the global economic assessment, whether it can take those burdens. From the document, it looks like no. Second, reciprocity of commitments from US, EU, and Australia. Actually, we cannot forget Australia and its emissions at this level. The third factor is China's status as a benign friendly norm maker. But right now, I don't think China feels the need to assert a benign or showcase a benign position on its own if the world is going to see it as a hostile power. So I have low expectations from China at Glasgow, and I don't see any more commitments or upgradations in the days to come. Thank you, Abhijit.
Thank you, Avinash. You nicely summarized what factors are driving China and the recent increase in geopolitical tension between China and many countries in the rest of the world seems to be a very important cause, and it doesn't paint a hopeful picture. If you listen to the conclusion that Avinash was ended with, that it doesn't paint a hopeful picture at all, from the biggest polluter in the world. So let's see what we see from China at the COP next week. Let's turn to our last speaker, Professor Sarangi, who will talk about India. India also has somewhat similar constraints like China. India is a developing country. We have a huge population of poor people below the poverty line. So the government has to be very cognizant about those realities and constrained by what they can commit to in terms of energy transition. So over to you, Gopal.
Yeah, very good evening to all of you. I hope that I'm audible. Am I audible? Yeah, thank you, Professor Abhijit, for inviting me to this forum. And it's really interesting and worth noting the speakers, particularly the learned speakers, and talking about different countries. So I won't be taking much time, given that we're running out of time. So what I'll do is that in next couple of 7-8 minutes, I'll just try to summarize what India is trying to do. So one is that, as rightly pointed out by my previous speaker, Professor Godbole, is about the reciprocity. So what India is expecting from other countries and how India is positioned itself globally. There's something which has implications not only for the country itself, also the implications regionally. So there are regional implications of the commitments that India is going to make and the expectations that India is kind of expecting from others. So I'll just draw from what Professor Abhijit has rightly said in the very beginning, is that the emissions, particularly when you look at the emissions, the question is about, and if you look at the entire expectations that is happening from COP26, is about the justice. The issue of justice is actually heart of the debate which is being considered. So when you look at the emissions, the question again is boiled down to the issue of absolute emission and the relative emission. Whether you're looking at the size of the emission as a country as a whole, or you're looking at the per capita emissions. More importantly, It has been in the year 6 report, which is talking about the carbon budget. And it says that starting from 2022, the total carbon budget that is available globally is 400 gigaton. Now everybody will be trying to, there is a competing demand for kind of having more allocation of this carbon budget. India is one of the biggest players, is also trying to push it forward, that it should be in a position, as you rightly pointed out in the very beginning, that common but differentiated responsibility also is applicable to this context of carbon budget. That's something which is very, very important when you look at the expectations that India has for other countries in terms of how the justice issue is integrated in a more fair way when you look at the carbon budget. This is one. Second, of course, is related to the evolving position of India. If you look at recent, particularly last couple of years, what India is trying to do is that kind of forming different coalitions, okay, as a diplomatic instrument to influence countries. They are coming up this word they call like-minded countries. Okay, that's something which is term used. I have seen that somewhere. So, and particularly the reference can be given to the ISA, International Solar Alliance, where there is a lot of thrust now to kind of bring countries together to the same platform, same table, and kind of strengthen the voice in the global platform, basically to bring out these issues related to the carbon budget, related to the emission issues, and then again boiling down to the issue of common and differentiated responsibilities. More importantly, you may be knowing about some of our participants and speakers may be knowing about the CDRE, Global Coalition of Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, right? So this is again kind of putting it forward and trying to see that, okay, whether this platform can usefully can be utilized, the diplomatic platform for influencing the global debate on climate change and trying to kind of get more share out of that. The Quad, which has been Australia, India, Japan, USA, sometimes it has been referred that Quad is probably the group which is trying to commit the net neutrality. That's actually not the case. India has clearly said that we are part of Quad, but we're not going to commit anything related to net, which has recently, I think, a study has come out in this newspaper. But I think the good part of India in vis-a-vis to China is basically the NDC. When you look at the NDC, I think, and primarily the three major commitments which are made by India, one is to reduce this emissions intensity, and the second one is to increasing the share of non-fossil fuel. So the word is non-fossil, okay? So that's something which is interesting. And then the carbon sink. I think particularly non-fossil fuel, India is going to, there is expectation that India probably kind of revise its NDC commitments. Maybe in other two commitments, particularly emission intensity and the sink, carbon sink, India may not do anything more, but at least non-fossil fuel, there is something. But it has a lot of implications when you look at this, as I said, in the domestic level, what you call kind of changes. Then net zero emissions, I don't think India is, given the understanding, given the debate going on, I don't think India is going to commit it, but India is primarily focusing on the pathways. India is saying that let's focus on pathways. As you rightly pointed out in the very beginning, that you should have medium term, intermediate term kind of goals. You should be looking at the final goal. At the end of the day, you find that nothing has happened. So you should actually keep on, and it's very much relevant when you connect it to SDGs, because SDG has a goal of 2030, so which actually clearly tells you that you have an intermediate goal, which is also not only going isolated, being connected with larger global goals like SDG. So that brings also the issue of what you call the climate and the sustainability in a more integrated manner. Now, these are actually the issues which are shaping up the India's position globally, and also the expectations that India has from the other countries and in the larger context of climate change. Now, when you look at the implications of all these regionally, particularly when you're talking about carbon sink and you're talking about region growth of renewables, there has been a lot of debate currently going on that renewables should not be, because the market structure of energy has been changing. Let's, for example, you are relying more on oil, so you can import oil from far off countries. But when you're relying on renewables, it's more like something which is called flexibility. If your neighbor has renewable, they can rely on that particular country. So the regional context of energy market is actually being deconstructed and reconstructed. So you have, let's say, Nepal has good amount of hydro and India has good amount of renewable. So India can rely on Nepal for the situations where you have intermittency, and Nepal can equally rely on India. So that kind of regional cooperation should be given priority when you look at the implementation and operationalization of the issues related to climate change. Second is carbon sink. For instance, let's say you know that Himalayan, if you look at the entire Himalayan belt, so it has a lot of potential to sink the carbon. But how are you going to kind of divide the entire carbon sink which is available for most of the countries? Bhutan, Nepal, India, everybody will be claiming that. Certain things actually cannot be based on the geographical or administrative divisions. How are you going to deal with that? So these are actually the regional questions which are flowing from the climate debate happening internationally. Then domestic context, I think, I don't know, I have several points to make on this. And then, as you most of you know, that India actually presents a case of dichotomies. All sorts of dichotomies you can observe. One, as I said, that there are sectoral integration happening, rightly pointed out by Professor Anika and Professor Garbol, all of you, is that the transport energy sector is getting integrated, right? The coal, moving away from coal and then promoting renewables has its own implications. A lot of debate currently going on. Moving away from coal, your eastern belt is rich in coal, western southern belt is rich in renewables. Your entire employment profile is going to change. Coal has its economy at different layers. At decentralized level, coal provides local economy, coal provides funds to the development of districts, coal provides money to the state governments, coal provides larger vertical. It kind of creates an informal economy. If you're moving away from coal, and there are issues with carbon locking. So when moving away from coal and trying to get into renewables, there are issues. Look at the current issue of coal shortage, coal crisis. Why is it happening? And I think we did a project on stranded assets. Okay, there has been a lot of investment which has gone into it. And the stranded assets is not only about the physical investment which has been made and not been recovered, also about the psychology which has gone into it. So there has been a psychology which has been developed among the investors that you should not get into coal. So that kind of an psychology which is creating this kind of rippling effect today, that coal shortage, coal scarcity. Can we believe that a country which has rich coal is why it's facing scarcity? So that's one. Second is also the issue of, as I said, the employment effects of this. And third is the fixed, as I said, the dichotomy is also about the issue of soft and hard, energy, right? So if you look at the development of Indian energy sector, it has been primarily focused on the large scale and privately promoted renewables, right? And which is actually kind of creating some kind of friction. Why is it so? Because if you look at large scale renewables, it has a lot of social costs, but in terms of the co-benefits, it actually has very less co-benefits. So government, if you look at countries like Germany, Australia, US, all these countries actually focus on decentralized renewables. If you look at the performance of India, India has not really done much in terms of rooftop or decentralized space. We have been kind of using at a kind of backup kind of a thing. We said that's a kind of not a main source of energy. So that has created some kind of a distinction between the hard and soft kind of an energy intervention. And then the focus on large scale renewables is actually not free of, they may be green, but there are issues within that. So I think the government cannot really rely completely on renewables because of the issues of this hard and soft energy, because of the issues of the social cost associated with energy, because of the issues of the fact that intermittency, and you have not really created a kind of mechanism which can address this. More importantly, at the top of that, as you know, that climate change has not been clearly defined in the Indian Constitution, and which actually creates kind of a competing and collaborative arrangement between the central government and the state governments. And energy, on the other hand, is in the concurrent list. And you have, states are equally empowered. So you see that a lot of, diversities, discrepancies, heterogeneities across the states. And you cannot really control them sometimes. The central, so whatever commitments are being made at the global level has implications while implementing them, operationalizing them at domestic level. So this is what in briefly about what I wanted to tell about the situation in India. But I think I completely agree with what Professor Garbol has rightly said, is that if you look at what India is trying to do, India is expecting that also reciprocity, which has been rightly pointed out, that India, while trying to volunteer or kind of committing voluntarily, also equally expecting that some kind of reciprocity in terms of the commitments made and financing and providing technology should be there from the developed countries. That's one. Again, second is that it has to carry out a domestic assessment of its commitments, because each of the commitments, a single commitment can has the potential, can create frictions in the country, given that you have a loose federal structure. Each of the provincial entities will have their own requirements, own competing and collaborative arrangements. All these can create So friction. So it has to be taken into account while doing those kind of commitments globally. Thank you, Professor Abhijit. Again, I'll be happy to be taking part in the question and answer session. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Gopal. We heard about some of the key factors influencing India's debate on climate neutrality, international negotiations, and so on. Not least the fact that India has to, as Gopal pointed out, it has to also equally emphasize the SDG goals. We have a huge poor population, and a lot of people are dependent on the coal economy. To just use the example of coal, so a sudden transition will leave millions of people behind. So that is also something that governments need to worry about. And also both central and state governments are so dependent on revenue from fossil fuels. So unless there is a package to compensate the state governments, suddenly if you phase out coal mining, then some of these coal mining states, the renewable energy is in the western states, as we heard. So that is not going to help the eastern states where coal mining is happening. So if you suddenly phase out coal, what will happen to the eastern states, their revenue? So these are complicated questions that that India has to grapple with, and the international dimension as well, that the reciprocity that both Avinash and Gopal has mentioned. So all of you, the audience, we will now go into question answers. I will first ask a couple of questions. In the meantime, please type your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. I think I also already see one. So please keep typing your questions in the question answer Q&A box. We will try to get as many as possible. So let me first start asking a couple of questions myself. And in the meantime, please add your questions to the Q&A box. My first question is to Marcos, representing the US. Now, we saw how the political stalemate in the US, and it's unlikely to change because of structural reasons. It's unlikely to change anytime soon. But we do need to make progress. Despite these difficulties, we do need to make progress. So reasonably progressive president like President Biden, what can the president themselves do to move the agenda forward, even if they don't get any help from Congress, even if the legislation is stuck in Congress? Can the president alone do certain things which can move the agenda forward, even in a very limited way?
Well, he can, or they can. They can issue executive orders. The president controls the execution of laws through all the federal agencies. All the national level agencies are essentially at his command. So he can tell them to take action within the letter of the law, which there is quite a lot of discretion. The laws are generally written very broadly, so that leaves a lot of discretion. And that's exactly what President Obama had done too, because Congress had refused to pass laws around climate. The danger there is that those executive orders can be undone by the next president. So they're not permanent in the same way that a law issued by Congress is, although it does take time. So President Trump, when he came into office after Obama, tried to undo as much as possible through his power. And it takes time. So the regulatory proceedings in the US are notoriously long. So it takes years before a change can be made. So if President Biden were to immediately issue directions to the federal agencies to start changing what they do within his powers, a lot could happen very rapidly. But he'd have to start it now because we don't know what the next president will look like. We don't know what the Congress could do. But I do want to say, just to point out too, that we talk about the US, we talk about all countries kind of in a singular sense, but I think the other speakers have highlighted kind of the diversity within the countries and the domestic challenges of bringing along other people. And the US is no different in that respect. And so a lot of the action that has happened is driven by the larger economic forces, but also there's a lot of uneven action at the state level and local level. And half of the states in the US have made commitments to climate change policy. So there is a lot of progressive action on the ground. It doesn't all happen at the federal or national level. And so I think that's where a lot of the hope we see that progressive change can happen is at the local level.
Yes, very good. The last point that Marcos made was very interesting. We know that California is such a big economy. If California was an independent country, it would be the 5th largest economy in the world. So, and as we know, California is quite a progressive state. They have adopted climate neutrality goals. So if California meets those goals, it's as if the 5th largest country in the world becomes carbon neutral. So as Marcos made this very important point that we may not see a lot of progress from the US Congress, but that doesn't mean change is not happening. So some important change is indeed happening, but of course, it is going to be limited without strong action from the federal government, from Congress. It is going to be limited in scope. My next question is to, we have 2 questions. I'll ask another question, the next question to Anika about the EU. Now, Gopal also has a question, I guess. We'll come to your question in a minute. We saw that how the big stalemate in the US, political stalemate, not only is we are not seeing much progress now, we don't even know who the next president will be, whether there will be someone like Trump who completely goes backward. So for the international, as far as the international community is concerned, US is a very unreliable partner. So under these circumstances, the EU is quite progressive. The EU wants to really move the agenda forward, but there is a limit to how much they can do unilaterally. If you do unilaterally, your economy will be hurt if nobody else takes up their share of the burden, so to speak. How much is the EU prepared to do unilaterally at this point, given that we have kind of accepted that the US is going to be an unreliable partner for the foreseeable future?
I don't think that the EU wants to go unilaterally one bit, but I've studied EU-China collaborations on decarbonizing the coal sector, for example. Not particularly successful. What we hear from within Germany and the new government is that they think about a climate club, which as a concept is a little, I don't know if it's completely suitable, because normally you have to pay something to get into a club. I think we are already in it all in some way or the other, just because we emit, right? So I'm not too sure about that entire idea, but what we believe is that there is great opportunity in the decarbonization for the economy. That has been a narrative within Germany for a long time, that if we are able to develop green technologies, that's something that will give us an advantage, and not just within Germany, European-wide, globally. But we think export. So what is it that we can export that makes us competitive in a sustainable way, in an ecologically sustainable way as well? At the same time, you need to go ahead with a good example, right? You need to show that it is possible to have a certain kind of economic performance that maintains well-being while reducing emissions. So if we can show, and I think there are first good examples, if we can show that, yes, it is possible without compromising well-being, then that's all it needs. But still, we are coming from different levels, I guess. Emissions here per capita are extremely high compared to what we find in India and other parts of the world. So people also have to start thinking about, okay, is it really necessary to take that flight? Why don't I take the train? Is it necessary to install an oil-based heating system? Are there alternatives? And actually what I see here is that the government is very proactive in supporting citizens to make that transition. For example, if someone wanted to buy or build a house today, build a house from scratch, you can get up to 50% support from the government to install rooftop solar PV, to get a heating, how is it called in English? I think it's called pumped heating. Heating pump, various heat pump, yeah.
Yes.
So various technical solutions that would help us to improve the efficiency, energy efficiency of buildings. but yeah, people need to be informed and need to be willing to accept that new kind of technology, you know, something that not necessarily a lot of people are familiar with yet. So there's also this, you know, skepticism towards the new.
Okay, thank you very much. Gopal has a question, so let's Gopal go ahead with your question.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, this is not a question, just a query for Professor Anika. That she mentioned about Poland moving away from the European Union. So is there, just wondering that, is there any way that the regional agreements are binding on individual countries in European Union? So, so can they do anything?
Yeah, it is definitely a multi-layered issue. I don't want to dramatize it, but I think part of the Polish government just don't want to accept the authority of EU legislation. They say it is not necessarily compatible with part of the Polish constitution. And just one issue is climate change. There are many others, but at the moment, it really looks like that the EU is trying to, or is penalizing Poland for trying to be disobedient. It is bound by laws for sure, but being bound by laws and then getting penalized and looking at the implementation side of everything, you know, whether they're going to pay or whether they're going to just follow their emission reduction targets, the national ones. That's always on a, you know, different sheet. Good enough?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for
Okay.
clarifying this.
Okay, now we can take a couple of quick questions from the audience. Let me jump to the second question first. There's a question about carbon markets. Like we had in the Kyoto Protocol, we had a CDM type mechanism. Do we foresee an important role of carbon markets playing an important role in the post 2020 global climate architecture? Who wants to take that question?
I didn't fully get it, to be honest.
The question about carbon markets.
Oh, you mean trading between?
Trading, carbon, yes, trading. What role do you see an important role playing in the moving ahead? Post 2020 climate.
To be honest, I haven't heard much about the clean, what it was called CDM, no, Clean Development Mechanism. I haven't heard much about it lately. It might be an active scheme, I'm not too sure. Back in the day, that's maybe 5-7 years or so, we had major issues with the credibility of the credit. So someone joked that it actually needed someone who would report, who would go monitor. Yeah, this monitor, report, verify mechanism came up in that context. So can we actually verify that wind park so-and-so is active, in place so-and-so? I mean,
yeah. So what Anika is flagging is that historically we have had problems with tracking and verifying. In order for carbon markets to work, the reductions must be verified. And in the past, whether it's the CDM or in the CDM mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, whether it's the EU ETS scheme, so there were problems related to the devising the architecture. In theory, it can work, but the devising the architecture has been a challenge. Gopal has a response to that as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think partly you have answered. I think I'd just like to kind of mention the India's position on this. India is trying to, because India has accumulated huge amount of CES from the earlier CDM regime, which has not been actually kind of credited. So now the India is saying that, first of all, you need to kind of convert that into the required credit, okay? And then saying that the minimum price of should be, every CER should be like $3. Okay, that is what they're actually putting forward. Yes, I see that there is a lot of future, particularly for market instruments like carbon market in future. But I think the problem, as rightly pointed out by both Professor Abhijit and Professor Anika, is about the transparency and accountability. And that actually led to one of the reasons why the market got collapsed. I think there is a need to frame the clear transparency and accountability rules under the Paris Agreement Article 6 in order to kind of, again, revive this market. And more importantly, countries are now kind of thinking of doing it internally. For instance, in India, even though we don't have a carbon market as such, but we have something called coal cess. So they have changed the name of that coal cess, which is currently 400 rupees per every ton of coal that we extract. I think these are actually, and what basis they have done it, so that's more like a researchable issue. And then you have your, today I think there is news that energy saving certificates have again been traded. So there are PAT and all that. So I think these are essentially, you can call proxy carbon markets, which are internally going to be implemented, and I think in a more intense manner. Thank you.
Marcos also has a response.
Yeah, I think in the US, I don't know about, I can't speak for the international context about the likelihood of carbon markets, but domestically in the US, we have had a successful example of a carbon market within the Northeast region of the US. It has a regional greenhouse gas initiative that controls carbon emissions from electricity utilities for electricity generation. And that's been in place for about a decade at this point. And that's been successful in terms of lowering emissions from that sector. The critics of that will say, though, it's been fairly conservative in the level of reductions that it's provoked. And some have argued that some of those changes would have happened regardless because of restructuring of the industry and the move to lower carbon intensity. But nevertheless, it's provided an example that we can do it, and there's current work underway to try to extend that model to transportation as well. And so that has been on the block for a while. So there's a lot of hope that that might actually get passed. So domestically within the US, there are working examples of a carbon trading that could provide a larger model for the US as a whole.
Yes, it's interesting that the successful examples we see tend to be on a smaller scale in a country like in US, with the power sector in a few states. It's already very well regulated and well studied. There's a lot of data and verification mechanisms of the emissions. So in that context, it is, one could argue, it's relatively easy to design a carbon market. Now, if you extend that either nationwide to all sectors or even internationally, the task becomes so much more complex. How do you have verification mechanisms in developing countries where data is very poor? Verification mechanisms are very poor. So in theory, it can be an effective tool, but its implementation can be a challenge when you do it internationally. I have another of my students, Aditi, is asking, in some countries like whether it's US or UK or even some European countries, is there any emphasis on sectoral strategies which are increasing rapidly, like say it's a fast fashion or emissions from food and agriculture? Do we see progress on some of these fronts? I mean, we all talk about the energy sector, but all these indexes, the food, the textiles, that sort of stuff, are we seeing progress on these sectors in some of the... Anika first or Marcos first, whoever wants to go.
I'm trying to think quickly about an example.
I think textiles and farming are very Indian. No? So textiles are not really on my radar, though I just watched a little bit of TV the other day, and they're now going for what they call slow fashion, and not just slow fashion, but fashion that is lasting, in the sense that, you don't need a jacket. You don't need 50 jackets over your lifetime. You need maybe 2 or 3 for the different seasons. That's it. So how can we produce sustainable clothing? That's a Swedish initiative. Certainly not just Swedish. I'm sure global initiatives or there's certainly global action taken on this. Farming is, from a German perspective, not a really emission intensive. So it is because of the feedstock, but the animal stock. But I think the chemical industry is an issue over here. Auto industry. We think heavily at the moment about hydrogen, green hydrogen, and where to source it from, and how to transform the industry with hydrogen. But that might not be too relevant for.
So let's move over to Marcos.
I think out of a non-energy context, those are most of the examples I can think of where there has been more concerted and deliberate progress. But on the food front, there is a growing market for sustainably grown food systems that work from local producers. So in the US, most farming is controlled by a few large agribusiness companies. And so there are very few local small farms throughout the US. Although there are certain markets, for example, in the Northeast or in the Midwest, areas that tend to be wealthier actually are willing to pay more for food that's produced according to certain standards, use of less pesticides, for example. And so there are parts of the country where there is an appetite, people literally and figuratively, for paying more for that kind of food. And so that's encouraging. And there's also been evidence that there's a decline in total meat consumption by the American public. But it's not always clear if that's happening because of any policy or climate consciousness. But nevertheless, it's a progressive move in the sense of reducing the overall impact from the food sector.
Yes, and also a local food, a big movement in some pockets, local food, which means you reduce transportation emissions. That's also a big movement in many Western countries. But as Marcos pointed out, more about public consciousness, not necessarily driven by policy, but also in very selected pockets, not universal. We see another question. We'll go a few minutes above time. Let's see. I'll ask a question for Avinash, who has been a little quite for the last few minutes. So in China, just like in India, we see that the cost of renewable energy is dropping rapidly. And in many places, it's cheaper than conventional sources. So one can make the argument that despite having a stalemate internationally, China can, just like India, out of its own interest, China can complete the renewable energy transition just driven by its own self-interest, just because it is cheaper. The one is cheaper than the other. Is this argument somewhat incomplete?
Kind of, yes. Actually, because if China has to meet that 80% by 2060 target, they have to increase their nuclear capacity by 10 times. The hydropower has to double, rather, they have to add double of what they already have on hydropower. And we all know that hydropower as a green clean energy is suspect. There's a debate that's ongoing on that. And then, so they're almost running out of the space for building more hydropower capacity. That's one. I mean, it's not completely over yet, but they will. I mean, there's a limitation on how much more hydropower they can develop. And there was a reason why these hydropower companies were controlled and were kind of let out through the Belt and Road Initiative projects because of their too much policy interference and political role domestically. On nuclear issues, I mean, nuclear and water also go together. So that competing demand for nuclear, hydropower, agricultural water, and that. So that is not an easy choice. And people are aware. So this American protests of the 70s, not in my backyard, the NIMBY protests, as we call them, they are very common in China over the last 10 years. And increasingly, they have started on the nuclear projects, or the Paraxylene case that we saw, and the blocks come up that this is going to affect your agricultural land, your lifespan will reduce, or reproductive capacity in the neighborhood will go down suddenly in 10 years if this XYZ or plan comes in. So social media spreads these rumors straight away. So that China doesn't have a control on, and people's awareness actually on these issues is good. So that awareness which makes people in China cities stay at home when they issue those amber and red warnings is actually, that makes it difficult for expansion of these new sectors. So like I mentioned at the beginning, that these hydro and electric and the nuclear will be the key sectors if they have to make the transition, but it's not going to be easy. Again, land disputes, competing demands for land, that has also become a common issue of disputes across several provinces in China. So these factors will determine the ability to transit to clean energy actually.
Yes, thank you, Avinash. We have another last question from, this is hopefully the last question from the audience. This is kind of what I was expecting, the issue of financial contributions from the north to the south. This issue has been very controversial, and we do not seem to be making much progress, whether the standard finance in terms of helping countries in their transition, or even for compensation of loss and damage. So in this case, both Anika and Marcos, can you throw any light on whether we are likely to see any progress on this issue, which is a very controversial?
I can say that the difficulty is that the U.S. has made pledges repeatedly for contributions for damage and loss and transition costs for other countries, but the U.S. hasn't delivered on those promises. And so it's contributed about less than half of what the promises have been made in the last 5 or 6 years. And so part of the challenge is that it is a money issue. And so in the US, again, that's that the president can make the pledge, but it requires the Congress to actually allocate the funding. And so if there's disagreement over that, then it can be a very complicated process to try to make those money transfers. And then the politics between countries, the geopolitics change. So there are concerns then about what it means to be contributing money that might make its way into the Chinese military complex, or might mean into going into countries that are under conflict, like in Sudan. And so that kind of complicates the picture of, because the US is very, very sensitive to the idea that the money might be rerouted to other kinds of purposes. And so that kind of complicates the politics of deciding when or how to allocate money. So for the future, I can't say, because I think at the moment, the relationships with China in particular and other countries are still being reconstructed after the Trump presidency. So that's also complicated the geopolitics of what it means to be donating, or not donating, but rather to contributing to that fund.
Yeah, Anika?
Yeah, I think along similar lines, though I hear from officials over here that by 2023, we would be ready to make the contribution. I think we're talking about the 100 billion annually in the Green Climate Fund, right? So yeah, that's what I hear from German sources, that over next year, we should be able to make our contribution. I'm not too sure what actually the share would be, but I think it is definitely still part of the debate, how to do it. I don't hear any such critique. I think people fairly well understand that there is a requirement. But yeah, the how to do it, how to make sure that it
Actually on this topic, I attended a seminar recently where there were experts who were dealing with these issues, and they were saying that not only is the commitment by the rich countries, but even the money that has been committed, it is notoriously difficult to actually get hold of it. Even when if you're from a developing country, if you have a verified project for adaptation, or even then there are so many hoops to jump through to get that money, that complicates it so much that even the only the best resourced NGOs or people with connections. For most people, it's like, the door is closed. So simply making it, even the amount of money that is committed, simply making it easily accessible can go a long way towards alleviating some of the helpful projects on the ground, which are really going to make a difference to people on the ground. Okay, do we have another question? But I don't think we have time. Yes, no, that was a comment, not a question. So I guess we'll have to close. I have more questions myself. We have a range of excellent speakers. I follow the climate debate, try to follow the climate debate closely, but each of you are specialized in these particular countries. And I myself have many other questions to ask, but we have to close it here. But thank you all for such an interesting session. So to sum up, we heard from experts that each country or region has its own set of challenges. I mean, we see a big dichotomy between what the scientists feel the urgency, the scientific urgency, versus what the politics will permit. And each country has its own set of political and economic constraints, and effectively that is guiding their decision making and their commitments. So regardless of what the scientists say, and the countries, the trajectories are not going to change so significantly in the immediate future. We might, the COP event starting from next week, we might call it a make or break event, but the calculus for these countries, the politics of these countries has not changed that much. So we are likely to see slow progress along the lines that we have been seeing. If you look at the past 5-10 years, we have seen some progress. The progress is not commensurate with the degree of urgency we are facing, but we have seen slow progress. So perhaps that is what we are going to see. Nothing game-changing, but slow and steady progress. Will that be enough to meet our targets? We don't know. A lot of people are very pessimistic. Perhaps there could be a game-changing technological breakthrough. Let's say in energy storage. We even 10 years back we saw with solar. The prices of solar have fallen 80% over the last 10 years. Even the most optimistic experts didn't predict this. So, and that is why we have seen such a boom in solar, and to some extent the same thing with wind. So perhaps there will be some similar breakthrough with, let's say, energy storage, which will revolutionize at least the power sector, and the needle will move much faster than what we can hope for now. But that's not guaranteed. We see the young, Professor Anika mentioned the young generation, the school kids walking out of school. They see that their future is doomed, so that's why they are taking to the streets. Perhaps that will wake us up. Perhaps that will force us to go beyond business as usual and really try to take on the more difficult tasks. Most of the progress we have seen so far has been relatively painful. The emission reductions we have seen are relatively painful. Switching from coal to natural gas, you don't have to change anything. Relatively painless. So now the painless stuff is almost done. Now we are at a point where we have to adopt more painful emission cuts, which would require us to sacrifice, make serious changes to our way of life, to our economy, and perhaps accept some sacrifices as well. Are we prepared to do that? That is the big question. So the next few years will determine whether we are ready. Even in countries that have been relatively successful in reducing emissions so far, we will, in the years going forward, we will see whether we are ready for more significant emission cuts that are potentially more painful. So let's see that we can conclude our event today, thanking all of the speakers, the audience. We have we had about 50 plus members of the audience from not only our students, we had from many different universities across India. We had a few journalists and NGOs as well. So thank you for patiently, and they contributed some insightful questions. And also I would like to, before closing, I would like to thank our deans of the respective schools for co-sponsoring the event, the School of Liberal Arts and Humanities and School of Government and Public Policy. and also our design team for designing the poster for the event, and the IT team who have not only created the Zoom webinar and the link, registration link and everything, but also Vikas is here from IT providing us tech support throughout the event. So all our events would not have been possible to run so smoothly without our IT team. So with that, I would like to conclude the event. Thank you very much.